Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
In a week last week, which saw the budget delivered, it was the House of Lords which garnered attention in the local government sector in respect of remote meetings. But more on that later. Dennis, trees and governance was also in the news. Tell us more.
Well, Helen, my first story is about what was described in the media as the Sheffield Tree Inquiry. A rather innocuous sounding piece, but the detail is utterly shocking. Deluded councillors in Sheffield behaved dishonestly and destroyed public trust by mishandling a dispute over the unnecessary felling of thousands of healthy trees in the city, an independent inquiry has found. Sheffield City Council twice misled the High Court during the fierce row, during which elderly residents were arrested when trying to protect trees from chainsaws. During one particularly contentious episode in autumn 2016, council contractors began work at 4:45 a.m., dragging residents out of bed to move their cars before protesters arrived. On another occasion, the council applied for an injunction against one of its own councillors, Green member Alison Teal. The council took her to court for breaching the injunction, only for her to be found not guilty. Another resident faced charges under Section 241 of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1992, which criminalises anyone who persistently stops someone from carrying out lawful work. The battle over Sheffield Street trees began in 2012 when the council signed a 25-year contract with the outsourcing firm Amy, which included the removal and replacement of 17,500 street trees. It was financed by a £1.2 billion PFI deal. Public opposition to what became known locally as the Chainsaw Massacre steadily grew, but senior council leaders paid no attention whatsoever. The independent report by Sir Mark Lowcock continues, out of touch with what significant numbers of local people thought and how the strength of feeling was growing, the council's leadership were deluded into believing that all was well. He heard evidence of a bunker mentality within the council's senior leadership team, which hardened as opposition grew, and a culture that was unreceptive to external views, discouraging of internal dissent, and prone to groupthink. Lowcock found that the council misled two High Court judges by passively allowing the court to rely on something it knew to be false and not correcting the record, namely the council's 5-year tree management strategy, which it knew was flawed. Between June 2016 and March 2018, police attended 40 tree protests in Sheffield and arrested 41 people. Of these, no further action was taken on more than half of those occasions. And Lowcock concluded in his report that the dispute did significant harm. Thousands of healthy and loved trees were lost. Many more could have been lost. Sheffield's reputation was damaged. Public trust and confidence in the council was undermined and has not been fully rebuilt. And many of the senior officers and councillors involved in the dispute even declined to attend the public hearing that was part of the inquiry. Sheffield gave the now time-worn and tiresome response to failure, namely that lessons were there to be learned from all of this. But of course, those lessons require a leadership who are prepared to listen to others. Well, there we have it, the Sheffield Tree Inquiry. Helen.
Quite astonishing, Dennis. Now, new data laws intended to cut down pointless paperwork for businesses and reduce annoying cookie pop-ups were introduced by the government last week. The Data Protection and Digital Information Bill was first introduced last summer and paused in September 2022 so that ministers could engage in a co-design process with business leaders and data experts, ensuring that the new regime, according to the government, meets data adequacy while moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach of the European Union's GDPR. Data-driven trade generated 85% of the UK's total service exports and contributed an estimated 259 billion for the economy in 2021. The improved bill will, according to the government, introduce a simple, clear and business-friendly framework that will not be difficult or costly to implement, taking the best elements of GDPR and providing businesses with more flexibility about how they comply with the new data laws. Ensure that the new regime maintains data adequacy with the EU. Reduce the amount of paperwork organisations need to complete to demonstrate compliance. Provide organisations with greater confidence about when they can process personal data without consent, and increase public and business confidence in AI technologies. Alongside these new changes, the bill will increase fines for nuisance calls and texts to be either up to 4% of global turnover or 17.5 million, whichever is greater, and aims to reduce the number of consent pop-ups people see online, which allow websites to collect data about an individual's visit. The bill will also seek to strengthen the Information Commissioner's Office through the creation of a statutory board with a chair and chief executive. Dennis, you have coverage of an important consultation for us next, I believe.
Indeed. Licensing is in the news quite a lot at the moment, and here's news about a new consultation. The Home Office has launched a consultation on whether there is support for making permanent the alcohol licensing provisions in the Business and Planning Act 2020, or whether to return to the provisions in the Licensing Act 2003. The Licensing Act 2003 allows premises license holders to sell alcohol for consumption on-site or for consumption off-site, or both. In response to the pandemic, the Business and Planning Act 2020 provided regulatory easements, which enabled holders of licenses that only allow sales for consumption on-site to automatically additionally do sales for consumption off-site without any need to amend their license. The Licensing Act 2003 also allows licensable activities to be carried out on a one-off basis without the need for a premises license or any other authorization by means of a temporary event notice. Provisions in the Business and Planning Act temporarily increased the annual number of temporary event notices that a licensed premises user can have per year. The Home Office consultation is aimed at the hospitality sector, local licensing authorities, the police, licensed premises owners, members of the public and other interested parties in England and Wales where these proposals apply. The consultation will run until the 1st of May, so licensing lawyers and specialists, please note.
Controversial legislation designed to curb strike action fails to meet the UK's human rights obligations, MPs and peers have warned. In a report published following legislative scrutiny of the strike's minimum service level bill, the committee found that reforms that would make it easier to sack striking workers and leave unions at risk of million-pound fines do not appear to be justified and need to be reconsidered. The committee also found that it would be possible to introduce minimum service levels in some sectors in a way that is more likely to be compliant with human rights law. While the European Convention on Human Rights does not include a right to strike, Article 11, which guarantees freedom of association, has been interpreted to cover the taking of strike action. This requires that any restrictions on strike action must be in accordance with the law, which requires its consequences to be foreseeable to those affected. Changes to the law must also meet a pressing social need and be proportionate to the aim being pursued. Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, Joanna Cherry KCMP, said, "Heavy-handed sanctions are compounded by vague rules that would leave striking workers and unions in confusion as to whether they had been met or not. The sectors included in the bill are also ill-defined, risking overreach into areas linked to the maintenance of vital public services. This means the bill, in our view, is likely to be incompatible with the human rights law, which provides a right to association and with it, protection for strike action." The government needs to think again and come back with legislation that better protects those rights guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights. The bill is currently in the House of Lords. Dennis, cheer us up with a good news story.
Well, my final story is indeed a success story about how a determined council can take on companies that engage in the international sale of counterfeit goods. Trading standards and public protection of consumers is up there as one of the most important local authority functions. A recent report from Westminster City Council explains why. The Council has called for stricter checks on those setting up companies in the UK after announcing that it has confiscated £1 million worth of counterfeit products in a 15-month-long crackdown on US candy stores on Oxford Street. The Council reported that it seized almost 7,000 items in its latest round of enforcement, which saw the confiscation of counterfeit vape pens, mobile phone cases, unsafe charging leads and travel adapters, and power banks with no safety labelling or UK company details. And commenting on the £1 million milestone, Council leader Councillor Adam Hugg said Westminster was dealing with sophisticated and determined groups that exploit UK legal loopholes to trade from its shoplets. Councillor Hugg stated that the biggest issue enabling unscrupulous traders is the fact that they're usually run by shell companies with fictitious directors. There is a glaring lack of governance, he said, around setting up companies in the UK, with only cursory checks on those who are the directors. He called on the government to implement the new economic crime bill to help clamp down on these loopholes and to provide government agencies such as Companies House and HMRC with far greater powers and funding. Now, does your council face similar issues with counterfeit goods? And are there changes to the law that you would like to see? Let us know via the forum page on the LLG website.
Now, returning to remote meetings, which I referenced at the start, there was a spectacular debate in the House of Lords where we heard passionate appeals for the amendment to the Levelling Up Bill to enable remote meeting provision for local authorities, and not just that reserved to planning meetings, but all meetings. LLG's and ADSO's Freedom of Information request to the government on the call for evidence was directly referenced by Baroness Scott, who read out the government's response that it was not in the public interest to release the information. As I mentioned in the blog last week, there was astonishment and audible tuts in response to this. No one could understand why the government is so resistant. Local choice for local authorities, which has a documented benefit to public sector engagement, which reduces travel costs and valuable time resources, which could enable a whole new demographic of individual to become local councillors, which future-proofs weather-related emergencies or health pandemics, and which is a provision enjoyed, as was noted by the House of Lords itself. The response on behalf of the government? The government is of the mind that good governance requires meetings to take place in person. LLG and ADSO are submitting a review to the government's response to our FOI, and we will continue as long as it takes to enable remote provision for local government. I say this all the time, but I absolutely mean it. We have the resolve, as do all our partner organisations on this. And on that rousing note, you can read more on the items discussed today, and many more besides, by going to Bulletin number 10, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Have a good week, everyone.